You're staring at a photograph of Stonehenge, and something doesn't add up. 5,000 years ago, before the wheel was perfected, before writing existed, before anyone had figured out how to smelt bronze properly, a group of humans decided to drag 30-ton stones across 200 miles of countryside and arrange them in a perfect circle. Why? What could possibly have been so important that people with stone tools and rope would spend generations moving mountains? This isn't just about Stonehenge. Across every continent, scattered through every epoch of human civilization, our ancestors were obsessed with building things that serve no obvious practical purpose. Massive stones arranged in patterns that make no sense. Earthworks that can only be appreciated from the sky. Temples that took centuries to complete. And here's the thing that should make you pause. These weren't built by advanced civilizations with cranes and concrete mixers. These were built by people who had to invent the technology as they went along. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most persistent mysteries of human behavior. Why did ancient people, struggling to survive in a world without modern medicine, agriculture, or even basic metallurgy, invest so much energy into building monuments that wouldn't help them hunt, wouldn't protect them from predators, and wouldn't feed their children? The answer isn't what you think, and it reveals something profound about how the human mind actually works. If you're the kind of person who lies awake wondering why civilizations rise and fall, why humans do things that seem irrational, or what our ancestors were really thinking when they looked up at the stars, you're in exactly the right place. This is where we explore the deep patterns that shaped our species, one mystery at a time. Let's begin with a simple observation that changes everything. When archaeologists first started studying megalithic sites, seriously, in the 19th and 20th centuries, they made a discovery that nobody expected. These monuments weren't randomly scattered across the landscape like the remnants of forgotten villages or abandoned settlements. They followed patterns, specific, intentional patterns that suggested something far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Take the stone circles of Britain and Ireland. There are over 1,000 of them, ranging from massive complexes like Stonehenge to small rings of modest stones in forgotten fields. But here's what's remarkable. They're not just circles, they're precisely calibrated instruments, aligned with astronomical events that repeat across decades and centuries. The summer solstice, the winter solstice, the rising and setting points of the moon at its extreme positions. These weren't accidents. Someone was paying very close attention to the sky. But it gets stranger. Similar patterns appear in completely different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The megalithic temples of Malta, built before the pyramids, incorporate the same astronomical alignments. The stone circles of Armenia, the sacred sites of ancient China, the medicine wheels of North America. Even Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited land on Earth, has monuments aligned to celestial events. This presents us with a puzzle that conventional archaeology has struggled to explain. If these monuments were just religious buildings or territorial markers, why the obsession with astronomy? Why invest so much effort in tracking the movements of celestial bodies? And why does this pattern repeat independently across cultures that had no contact with each other? The answer lies in something that modern humans have almost completely forgotten the relationship between memory and place. Before writing, before books, before any external method of storing information, human societies had to solve a fundamental problem. How do you preserve knowledge across generations? How do you ensure that critical information about seasons, weather patterns, agricultural timing, and social customs survives when the people who hold that knowledge die? The solution our ancestors developed was both elegant and profound. They encoded information directly into the landscape itself, using monuments as massive permanent memory devices. Consider what life was like for a Neolithic farming community in Britain 5,000 years ago. Your survival depended on planting crops at exactly the right time. Too early, and frost would kill the seedlings. Too late, and the harvest would fail before winter arrived. You had to know when the rains would come, when the animals would migrate, when certain plants would be ready for gathering. This wasn't casual knowledge. This was life or death information that had to be preserved with perfect accuracy. But here's the problem. Human memory, even at its best, is unreliable. Stories change in the telling. Details get lost. Critical timing gets confused. What you need is something external, something permanent, something that can't be forgotten or altered. You need the landscape itself to remember for you. This is where megalithic monuments reveal their true purpose. They weren't just buildings, they were calendars, libraries, and databases carved in stone. When the sun rose through a specific gap in the stones on the longest day of the year, it was time to harvest. When certain stars appeared above the monument at dawn, it was time to plant. The stones themselves became the keepers of essential knowledge. But the genius of this system goes deeper than simple astronomical calculation. These monuments didn't just store information. They made that information sacred, wrapping practical knowledge in ritual and ceremony that ensured it would be remembered and respected. Think about how this would work in practice. Every year, as the summer solstice approached, the community would gather at the stone circle. They would watch as the sun traced its familiar path across the sky, finally rising directly through the heelstone at Stonehenge or illuminating the inner chamber at Newgrange. This wasn't just a practical observation. It was a spiritual experience that connected the community to the cycles of the cosmos and to their ancestors who had built the monument. The ritual aspect was crucial because it solved another fundamental problem. How do you motivate people to maintain and protect knowledge across generations? If astronomical observations were just practical calculations, they might be forgotten during times of crisis or social upheaval. But if those same observations were wrapped in sacred ceremony, connected to the ancestors, and celebrated as community events, they became much more likely to survive. This is why megalithic sites often show evidence of use across thousands of years. They weren't built and abandoned. They were maintained, modified, and continuously used by successive generations who understood their value. The knowledge they preserved was too important to lose. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed just how sophisticated these ancient memory systems actually were. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built over 11,000 years ago, we find evidence of astronomical alignments, symbolic carvings, and complex ritual activities that suggest a level of intellectual sophistication that was previously unthinkable for hunter-gatherer societies. Even more remarkably, Some monuments appear to encode multiple layers of information simultaneously. The same stone circle might track solar events, lunar cycles, and stellar positions, while also serving as a focal point for seasonal ceremonies, a burial ground for important community members, and a gathering place for trade and social interaction. This multifunctional approach makes perfect sense when you understand that these communities couldn't afford to waste effort on single-purpose structures. Every major construction project had to serve multiple vital functions simultaneously. A monument that only tracked the summer solstice wouldn't justify the enormous investment of time and labor required to build it. But a monument that served as calendar, temple, cemetery, and community center would be worth any sacrifice. The scale of that sacrifice is hard for modern minds to comprehend. Moving the massive stones used in monuments like Stonehenge required coordinated effort from hundreds of people over many years. Recent experiments have shown that transporting a single trilithon the distance from the Welsh quarries to Salisbury Plain would have required teams of workers, specialized equipment, and careful planning that stretched across seasons. This wasn't casual construction. This was a civilization-level commitment to preserving knowledge in the most permanent form possible. Communities were willing to invest decades of collective effort because they understood that the information encoded in these monuments was literally a matter of survival. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. They got it right. Many of these ancient astronomical alignments are accurate to within fractions of degrees. The builders of Stonehenge calculated the 18-year lunar cycle with precision that wasn't matched by European astronomers until the Renaissance. The Maya predicted solar eclipses centuries in advance. Aboriginal Australians encoded star maps into rock art that remained accurate across thousands of years. These weren't primitive people stumbling towards civilization. These were sophisticated thinkers who understood that knowledge was power, that information was survival, and that the only way to guarantee the preservation of critical data was to write it in stone across the landscape itself. But there's something else happening here, something that reveals an even deeper truth about human nature and the way our minds actually work. The monuments weren't just practical. They were doing something to the human brain itself, something we're only beginning to understand through modern neuroscience. When you stand inside a stone circle, when you watch the sunrise align perfectly with megalithic architecture, when you participate in ceremonies that connect you to cycles larger than your individual life, something profound happens in your neural pathways. Your brain doesn't just process this as information. It processes it as meaning. And meaning, it turns out, is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Studies of memory formation show that we remember emotionally significant events far better than mundane information. A date written on a calendar might be forgotten within days, but a ceremony where you watched your ancestors' spirits return with the rising sun, where you felt connected to forces beyond your comprehension, where the entire community gathered in shared reverence that becomes embedded in your memory with crystalline clarity. This is why megalithic builders didn't just create astronomical calculators. They created experiences. They understood, whether consciously or intuitively, that information wrapped in ceremony, embedded in sacred space, and connected to transcendent meaning would survive in human memory far longer than simple practical knowledge. Walk through any major megalithic site, and you'll feel this immediately. These places weren't designed just to be functional. They were designed to be overwhelming. The massive scale, the precise geometry, the careful integration with landscape features, the way sound behaves differently inside stone circles, the play of light and shadow across carved surfaces. Every element was calculated to create an experience that would burn itself into memory. At Newgrange in Ireland, built 5,000 years ago, the entire monument is oriented so that once per year, on the winter solstice, a shaft of sunlight penetrates the darkness of the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. Imagine being inside that chamber, surrounded by your community, watching as your ancestors' architectural miracle transforms darkness into light at the precise moment when the year begins its return toward spring. This isn't just astronomy. This is theater. This is psychology. This is a technology for creating unforgettable experiences that would ensure critical seasonal knowledge was passed down through generations with perfect accuracy. But the deeper we dig into these sites, the more we discover that our ancestors were operating on levels of sophistication that challenge everything we thought we knew about prehistoric intelligence. Recent analysis of megalithic sites using ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning, and advanced acoustic modeling has revealed layers of complexity that previous generations of archaeologists couldn't even detect. Take the acoustic properties of stone circles. For decades, researchers noticed that these monuments seem to have unusual sound characteristics. Voices carry differently inside them. Music resonates in specific ways. What seemed like coincidence has proven to be intentional design. Acoustic analysis of sites like Stonehenge shows that the monument was specifically engineered to amplify human voices within the circle while muffling sounds from outside. The result is an acoustic environment where speakers inside the circle can be heard clearly by everyone present, while external noise is reduced to a minimum. This creates a natural amphitheater effect that would have made these sites ideal for community gatherings, ceremonial speeches, and the oral transmission of important cultural knowledge. Even more remarkably, some monuments appear to have been tuned to specific frequencies. At certain stone circles, clapping or drumming produces clear echo effects that repeat at precise intervals. Some researchers have found evidence that these echo patterns might have been used as timing devices, helping communities maintain accurate rhythmic ceremonies or even calculate time intervals without mechanical clocks. This level of acoustic engineering requires not just an understanding of sound physics, but the ability to predict how massive stone structures would behave acoustically before they were built. The builders of these monuments were working with principles that weren't formally understood by European science until centuries later, and the engineering challenges go far beyond acoustics. The precision required to create accurate astronomical alignments using only stone tools and rope is staggering. Consider that the Earth's rotation creates tiny changes in the apparent positions of stars over long periods. To maintain accurate astronomical alignments across centuries, monument builders had to account for these gradual shifts. Evidence from sites across Europe suggests they did exactly that. Many stone circles show signs of being periodically adjusted, with stones moved slightly to maintain their astronomical accuracy as celestial positions shifted over generations. This implies not just sophisticated initial planning, but ongoing observational programs that lasted for centuries. We're talking about communities that maintained scientific traditions across dozens of generations, passing down not just the knowledge of when to observe astronomical events, but the technical skills needed to maintain and adjust complex stone instruments over vast periods of time. This challenges our fundamental assumptions about prehistoric societies. We tend to think of scientific knowledge as a recent development, something that emerged with writing and formal institutions. But the evidence from megalithic sites suggests that sophisticated scientific traditions existed thousands of years before the first written records. These weren't isolated achievements either. The same level of astronomical sophistication appears at sites across the globe, often in cultures that had no contact with each other. The Goseck Circle in Germany, built 7,000 years ago, tracks solar and lunar cycles with precision comparable to Stonehenge. The Nabta Playa site in Egypt's Sahara Desert, even older, shows evidence of advanced astronomical observation and calendar calculation. In the Americas, sites like Cahokia in Illinois and Chaco Canyon in New Mexico demonstrate the same combination of massive construction projects, precise astronomical alignments, and sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. These monuments were being built by societies we traditionally classify as prehistoric, but their achievements rival those of classical civilizations. What becomes clear is that the human capacity for scientific observation, mathematical calculation, and engineering innovation is far older than we previously imagined. Our ancestors weren't waiting around for the invention of writing or the development of formal institutions to begin serious intellectual work. They were conducting sophisticated research programs, developing complex technologies, and solving challenging engineering problems thousands of years before recorded history begins. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of megalithic achievement isn't the technical sophistication. It's the social organization required to sustain these projects across multiple generations. Building Stonehenge required not just the ability to move 30-ton stones across hundreds of miles. It required a society capable of coordinating massive labor projects, managing complex supply chains, and maintaining institutional memory across decades of construction. The monument wasn't built in a single burst of activity. Archaeological evidence shows it was constructed, modified, and expanded over a period of more than 1,500 years. This means that communities had to develop systems for preserving architectural knowledge, maintaining construction traditions, and passing specialized skills from one generation to the next. They needed social institutions stable enough to sustain multi-generational projects, economic systems capable of supporting large numbers of specialized workers, and cultural mechanisms for motivating continued investment in projects that wouldn't be completed within any individual lifetime. In other words, they needed civilization. Not the version of civilization we recognize from textbooks with cities and writing and formal governments, but something functionally equivalent: complex, sophisticated, durable social systems capable of achieving goals that transcended individual human lifespans. The implications are profound. We've been thinking about the development of human civilization as a linear progression from simple hunter-gatherer bands to complex agricultural societies to urban civilizations. But the megalithic evidence suggests a different pattern entirely. Perhaps our ancestors achieved a form of civilization that was fundamentally different from what we recognize today. Instead of concentrating power and knowledge in cities and institutions, they distributed it across the landscape itself. Rather than building monuments to glorify rulers or display wealth, they created technologies for preserving essential knowledge and maintaining social cohesion across vast spans of time. This distributed model of civilization makes perfect sense when you consider the constraints these societies faced. Without writing, without metallurgy, without beasts of burden in many regions, centralized authority would have been nearly impossible to maintain. But a network of sacred sites, each encoding crucial information and serving as focal points for community gathering, could unite scattered populations across enormous territories. Recent archaeological work has revealed that megalithic sites weren't isolated monuments. They were connected by ancient pathways, aligned with each other across landscapes, and integrated into complex regional systems that functioned as prehistoric information networks. In Britain, the Cursus monuments, massive earthworks that stretch for miles across the countryside, appear to connect different megalithic sites into unified ceremonial landscapes. These aren't random paths, they're precisely surveyed alignments that link stone circles, burial sites, and other monuments into coherent systems spanning dozens of miles. Similar patterns appear worldwide. The Nazca lines in Peru connect ceremonial sites across vast distances. Aboriginal Australian song lines link sacred locations across entire continents. The ancient straight tracks of Ireland, called fairy paths in folklore, connect megalithic sites in perfectly straight lines that ignore natural topography. What emerges is a picture of prehistoric societies that were far more interconnected and sophisticated than we previously imagined. These weren't isolated tribal groups struggling for survival. These were participants in continent-spanning networks that shared knowledge, coordinated activities, and maintained cultural connections across distances that wouldn't be regularly traversed again until the modern era. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. As impressive as these ancient achievements were, they represent something we've fundamentally lost. Not just the technical knowledge of how to build megalithic monuments, but the deeper understanding of why such monuments were necessary in the first place. Modern humans live in a world where information is abundant, cheap, and instantly accessible. We can store vast libraries of knowledge on devices that fit in our pockets. We can communicate across continents in real time. We can access the accumulated wisdom of centuries with a simple search query. But this abundance has created its own problems. We're drowning in information while starving for meaning. We have access to more knowledge than any generation in history, yet we struggle to distinguish between what's important and what's merely noise. We can store unlimited amounts of data, but we're losing the ability to remember what actually matters. Ancient monument builders faced the opposite problem. They had limited capacity for storing information, so everything they chose to preserve had to be absolutely essential. Every alignment, every carved symbol, every ritual practice had to earn its place through demonstrated value across generations. The result was a kind of distilled wisdom, refined through centuries of use into its most essential elements. This process of distillation created something we rarely see in our modern information environment: knowledge that was simultaneously practical and profound, technical and spiritual, individual and communal. The same monument that told farmers when to plant their crops also connected them to cosmic cycles, ancestral wisdom, and transcendent meaning. Consider what happens to a community when their primary source of essential knowledge is a sacred monument that requires collective participation to interpret. Every important decision becomes a community event. Every critical observation becomes a shared experience. Knowledge isn't hoarded by specialists or hidden in archives. It's embedded in practices that bring people together and strengthen social bonds. This creates a completely different relationship between information and society. Instead of knowledge being something you consume passively, it becomes something you participate in actively. Instead of learning being an individual activity, it becomes a communal ritual. Instead of wisdom being abstract information stored in databases, it becomes lived experience encoded in sacred space. The psychological effects of this difference are profound. When knowledge comes through participation in meaningful ceremonies at sacred sites, it's not just information entering your brain. It's identity formation, community bonding, and spiritual experience, all wrapped into a single activity. The knowledge becomes part of who you are, not just something you happen to know. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient monument builders seem to have understood intuitively. The human brain remembers embodied experiences far better than abstract information. When you learn something through physical participation, emotional engagement, and social interaction, it creates much stronger and more durable memories than passive information consumption. This is why ancient societies invested so much effort in creating monumental learning environments. They weren't just storing information, they were optimizing the conditions under which that information would be learned, remembered, and transmitted. Every aspect of the experience, from the massive scale of the monuments to the precise timing of ceremonial events, was calculated to maximize the psychological impact and ensure perfect transmission across generations. But there's something even deeper happening here, something that reveals a fundamental truth about human nature that we've largely forgotten in our modern world. The monuments weren't just about preserving practical knowledge or creating memorable experiences. They were about something that every human society needs, but modern civilization has largely abandoned: a shared sense of purpose that transcends individual lifetimes. When you participate in building a monument that will take generations to complete, when you maintain astronomical observations that will benefit communities centuries in the future, when you invest your life's work in projects whose full significance won't be realized until long after your death, you're participating in something larger than yourself. You're contributing to a story that began before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. This kind of transgenerational purpose seems to be essential for human psychological well-being, but it's almost completely absent from modern life. We live in societies focused on quarterly profits, annual budgets, and individual achievement within single lifetimes. We've lost the ability to think and act on the timescales that megalithic societies took for granted. The psychological costs of this shift are becoming increasingly apparent. Modern humans report unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and existential meaninglessness, despite having access to material comforts and opportunities that would have seemed miraculous to our ancestors. Part of this crisis may stem from our disconnection from the kinds of long-term, community-oriented, transcendent purposes that megalithic societies built their entire cultures around. Ancient monument builders understood something we've forgotten. Humans need to feel connected to projects larger than themselves, timescales longer than their individual lives, and purposes more significant than their personal success. The monuments provided exactly this kind of connection, linking individuals to cosmic cycles, ancestral wisdom, and community legacy in ways that created profound psychological satisfaction and social stability. This insight suggests that megalithic monuments weren't just primitive attempts at architecture or astronomy. They were sophisticated technologies for creating and maintaining human meaning on both individual and social levels. They solved fundamental psychological and social problems that we're still struggling with today, using methods we've largely abandoned, but perhaps shouldn't have. The more we study these ancient sites, the more they seem to offer not just historical curiosity, but practical wisdom about how human societies can create lasting institutions, preserve essential knowledge, and provide meaningful purpose for their members. The techniques they developed for embedding knowledge in landscape, creating memorable experiences, and motivating long-term cooperation remain relevant to our modern challenges. Perhaps most importantly, megalithic societies demonstrate that it's possible to create sophisticated, durable, meaningful civilizations without many of the features we consider essential to advanced society. They achieved remarkable things without writing, without metal tools, without centralized government, without formal educational institutions. What they had instead was something we've largely lost: a deep understanding of how to align human psychology with natural cycles, community needs, and transcendent purposes. Their monuments stand as evidence that there are multiple paths to civilization, different ways of organizing knowledge and society that can achieve remarkable results. As we face our own challenges with information overload, social fragmentation, and existential meaninglessness, the wisdom embedded in these ancient stones may offer insights we desperately need. The question isn't whether we should try to recreate megalithic society, which would be neither possible nor desirable. The question is whether we can learn from their achievements and apply their insights to our modern context. Can we find ways to embed essential knowledge in our landscapes and communities? Can we create institutions that operate on timescales longer than individual lifetimes? Can we design experiences that connect people to purposes larger than themselves? These ancient monument builders faced fundamental human challenges that haven't changed despite all our technological progress. They developed solutions that worked for thousands of years, creating some of the most enduring achievements in human history. Their stones still stand, their alignments still function, their purposes still inspire wonder and respect. In our age of rapid change and information overload, perhaps it's time to remember what they knew about the relationship between memory, meaning, and the human need for connection to something eternal. The monuments they left us aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're instruction manuals for creating lasting meaning in human communities. And that instruction is written not in books or databases, but in the stones themselves, waiting for us to remember how to read the language of landscape, ceremony, and shared purpose that once bound human communities together across vast expanses of time and space. The megaliths remember? The question is whether we're ready to listen. But listening requires more than just academic curiosity. It demands that we confront an uncomfortable truth about our relationship with time itself. Modern civilization operates on what we might call the tyranny of the immediate. Everything must produce results within fiscal quarters, election cycles, or individual careers. We've built entire economic and political systems around the assumption that value can only be measured in short-term gains. But megalithic societies operated on completely different temporal assumptions. When the builders of Stonehenge began quarrying stones in Wales, they knew they were starting a project that would outlast their great-grandchildren. When communities gathered to realign stone circles as celestial positions shifted over centuries, they were participating in maintenance cycles that spanned dozens of generations. This wasn't inefficiency. This was a completely different understanding of what human achievement actually means. Consider the implications of this temporal perspective. In a society organized around multi-generational projects, every decision must be evaluated not just for its immediate consequences, but for its effects across centuries. You can't exploit resources recklessly when your descendants will need them to maintain the monuments. You can't make short-sighted social decisions when community stability must last long enough to complete projects that take lifetimes to finish. This creates what economists might call intergenerational accountability, but what ancient societies understood as basic common sense. The future wasn't an abstract concept to be worried about later. It was a concrete reality that had to be planned for, invested in, and actively constructed through present actions. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that megalithic societies developed remarkably sophisticated systems for maintaining this long-term perspective. At sites across Europe, we find evidence of knowledge preservation techniques that ensured critical information would survive social disruptions, climate changes, and cultural shifts that might destroy less robust storage methods. The Carnac stones in France, for example, represent one of the most complex information storage systems ever devised. Over 3,000 standing stones, arranged in precise geometric patterns, stretch across miles of landscape. For decades, archaeologists assumed these were simply ceremonial arrangements, but detailed analysis reveals layers of encoded information that functioned as a kind of Stone Age database. The positions of individual stones correspond to astronomical observations, seasonal markers, and what appear to be mathematical relationships that encode practical knowledge about everything from optimal planting times to predictive models for weather patterns. But this information isn't stored in any single location that could be lost or destroyed. It's distributed across the entire landscape in patterns that would remain readable even if significant portions of the system were damaged. This redundancy principle appears at megalithic sites worldwide. Critical information is never stored in just one place or one format. The same knowledge appears encoded in stone alignments, earthwork patterns, carved symbols, and ceremonial practices simultaneously. Lose any single element, and the information survives in the others. This created information storage systems more robust than anything we've developed with modern technology. But the genius of these systems goes beyond mere redundancy. They were self-correcting, because the information was embedded in observable phenomena like astronomical alignments. Any errors or corruptions in the stored knowledge would become apparent over time as predictions failed to match reality. Communities could detect when their stored information had become inaccurate and make corrections based on fresh observations. This creates a form of knowledge storage that's not just durable, but adaptive. Unlike written records, which can preserve errors indefinitely, or digital systems, which can fail catastrophically, megalithic information storage systems were constantly tested against reality and automatically updated when necessary. Modern information theorists are only beginning to appreciate how sophisticated these ancient systems actually were. They solved fundamental problems in knowledge preservation that we still struggle with today. How to store information in formats that remain accessible across technological changes, how to prevent data corruption over long time periods, how to maintain accuracy without centralized authority, and how to ensure that critical knowledge survives social disruptions. But perhaps most remarkably, they solved these technical problems while simultaneously addressing the psychological and social challenges of long-term thinking. The same monuments that stored essential information also provided the ritual frameworks and community structures needed to motivate people to maintain and use that information across generations. This integration of technical and social solutions reveals something profound about how ancient societies understood the relationship between knowledge and community. They didn't separate information storage from meaning-making, practical knowledge from spiritual experience, or individual learning from social cohesion. Everything was designed to work together as an integrated system for creating and maintaining human culture across vast spans of time. The psychological sophistication of this approach becomes clear when you consider what happens to a community that regularly gathers at monuments their ancestors built centuries earlier. You're not just accessing stored information, you're participating in a direct physical connection to previous generations that stretches back to the beginning of your culture's memory. Standing where your ancestors stood, observing the same astronomical alignments they used to organize their lives, participating in ceremonies that connect you to cycles larger than human history, creates a very different sense of identity than anything available in modern society. You become part of a story that began long before your birth and will continue long after your death. This kind of deep temporal connection appears to be essential for human psychological well-being, but it's almost completely absent from contemporary life. We live in societies with no meaningful connections to our ancestral past and little investment in our distant future. The psychological costs of this temporal isolation may be far greater than we realize. Studies of traditional societies that maintain connections to ancestral lands and long-term cultural practices show dramatically lower rates of anxiety, depression, and existential meaninglessness compared to modern populations. Part of this difference may stem from the psychological benefits of feeling embedded in stories and purposes that transcend individual lifetimes. Megalithic societies had solved this problem through their monuments. Every individual knew they were part of a project that began with their earliest ancestors and would continue with their descendants. Their personal actions contributed to something permanent, meaningful, and larger than themselves. This created a form of psychological security and purpose that modern society has largely abandoned. But the monuments didn't just provide individual psychological benefits. They created forms of social organization that may have been more stable and sustainable than anything we've achieved with modern institutions. Because megalithic projects required multi-generational cooperation, they created powerful incentives for maintaining social harmony and continuity. Communities couldn't afford internal conflicts that might disrupt long-term projects. They couldn't risk social fragmentation that might lead to the abandonment of essential knowledge. They had to develop institutions capable of resolving disputes, maintaining cooperation, and ensuring smooth transitions of leadership across generations. Archaeological evidence suggests they were remarkably successful at this. Many megalithic sites show continuous use across thousands of years, with evidence of ongoing maintenance, periodic upgrades, and consistent ceremonial practices that survived multiple cultural transitions. This level of institutional stability is unprecedented in recorded history. How did they achieve this? Part of the answer lies in the way megalithic projects distributed power and authority. Unlike later civilizations, organized around centralized leadership, megalithic societies appear to have embedded authority in the landscape itself. The monuments, not human rulers, were the ultimate arbiters of important decisions. When disputes arose about timing for agricultural activities, the stones provided the answer through their astronomical alignments. When communities needed to coordinate activities across large regions, the monument network provided the framework. When questions arose about proper ceremonial practices, the physical requirements of the sites determined appropriate behaviors. This created a form of governance that was simultaneously deeply democratic and remarkably stable. No individual or group could claim authority over the community because ultimate authority resided in the monuments themselves, which belonged to all members of the society equally and had been built through collective effort across generations. But this system only worked because everyone understood and accepted the deeper principle underlying megalithic society, the recognition that human communities are part of larger patterns that transcend individual will and preference. The astronomical cycles tracked by the monuments weren't subject to political manipulation or personal opinion. They simply were, and human activity had to align with them or face practical consequences. This acceptance of constraints imposed by natural cycles created a very different relationship between human agency and natural law than what we see in modern society. Instead of seeing nature as something to be conquered or controlled, megalithic societies saw themselves as participants in cosmic patterns that were larger and more enduring than human civilization. This perspective had profound implications for how they approached everything from resource management to social organization. You can't exploit natural systems unsustainably when your entire culture is organized around the principle of aligning with natural cycles. You can't make decisions based purely on short-term human preferences when your society is committed to projects that must remain viable across centuries. The result was a form of civilization that was inherently sustainable in ways that modern society has never achieved. Megalithic communities maintained stable relationships with their environments for thousands of years, creating monuments that still function perfectly after 5 millennia, using social systems that preserved essential knowledge and maintained community cohesion across longer time periods than any recorded civilization. But sustainability wasn't achieved through primitive simplicity or technological limitations. These societies developed sophisticated technologies, complex social institutions, and advanced intellectual traditions. They achieved sustainability through wisdom, through understanding the principles that govern long-term success and organizing their entire cultures around those principles. The monuments they left us aren't just impressive engineering achievements or fascinating archaeological puzzles. They're demonstrations of what becomes possible when human societies align themselves with patterns larger than immediate human desires. They show us what we might achieve if we could learn to think and act on the timescales that actually matter for creating lasting solutions to fundamental problems. And this brings us to perhaps the most important lesson megalithic societies have to teach us. The challenges they faced weren't fundamentally different from the challenges we face today. They had to figure out how to preserve essential knowledge across generations, how to coordinate large-scale cooperative projects, how to create meaning and purpose in human communities, how to maintain sustainable relationships with natural systems, and how to build institutions that could survive disruptions and changes. They solved these problems using principles that remain valid today, even though the specific technologies and social forms they developed may not be directly applicable to our current situation. The principles themselves, the deep insights about human psychology, social organization, and the relationship between knowledge and community that guided their achievements, these remain as relevant now as they were 5,000 years ago. Their monuments stand as proof that these principles work. They created achievements that have outlasted every empire, survived every catastrophe, and continue to inspire wonder and respect after millennia. In a world where most human creations become obsolete within decades, the megaliths remain functional, meaningful, and instructive. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that creating lasting value doesn't require abandoning human nature or ignoring practical constraints. Megalithic societies worked with human psychology, not against it. They found ways to make long-term thinking emotionally satisfying, to make community cooperation individually rewarding, and to make practical knowledge spiritually meaningful. They show us that it's possible to create forms of civilization that enhance rather than suppress the best aspects of human nature, that solve practical problems while addressing deeper psychological needs, and that achieve remarkable things while maintaining harmony with natural systems. The stones remember all of this. They remember what we were capable of when we organized our societies around principles larger than immediate gratification. They remember what we achieved when we thought in terms of generations rather than quarters, when we embedded our knowledge in permanent forms rather than ephemeral media, when we created institutions designed to serve the future rather than exploit the present. Most importantly, they remember that none of this required superhuman abilities or miraculous technologies. It required wisdom, patience, and the commitment to participate in projects larger than individual lifetimes. These are capacities that every human community possesses. The question is whether we're willing to use them. The megaliths are still there, still functioning, still teaching their lessons to anyone willing to listen. They're not museum pieces or tourist attractions. They're instruction manuals for creating sustainable civilization, written in the most permanent language humans have ever devised. Stone aligned with stars, knowledge embedded in landscape, meaning carved into the earth itself. In our age of rapid change and short-term thinking, perhaps it's time to remember what they have to teach us about building things that last. The monuments remember what we've forgotten about the relationship between knowledge and survival, but they also remember something else, the precise moment when everything began to change. Around 4,000 years ago, something unprecedented happened in human civilization. For the first time in our species' history, communities began abandoning their megalithic traditions. Not all at once, not everywhere, but the pattern is unmistakable across multiple continents. Sites that had been maintained for millennia were suddenly left to decay. Astronomical knowledge that had been preserved for thousands of years was allowed to fade. Monument building traditions that had defined entire cultures simply stopped. What caused this shift? The answer lies in one of the most consequential inventions in human history, something so transformative that it changed not just how we store information, but how we think about information itself: writing. The development of written language around 5,000 years ago created the first portable, scalable method of information storage in human history. Suddenly, you didn't need massive stone monuments to preserve essential knowledge. You could encode the same information on clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, or carved inscriptions that required a fraction of the labor and resources that megaliths demanded. From a purely practical standpoint, this was obviously an improvement. Writing was more efficient, more flexible, and more accessible than monument-based information storage. But efficiency isn't everything, and the transition from megalithic to written knowledge systems came with costs that we're only beginning to understand. Consider what happens to a community when their primary knowledge storage system shifts from shared monuments to written texts. With megaliths, accessing important information required community participation, physical presence at sacred sites, and engagement with ritual practices that reinforced social bonds and cultural values. With writing, information becomes something that individuals can access privately, without community involvement, without ceremonial context, without the embodied experience that made megalithic knowledge so memorable and meaningful. This shift from communal to individual knowledge access had profound implications for social organization. Megalithic societies were inherently egalitarian when it came to information access. Everyone could participate in the ceremonies. Everyone could observe the astronomical alignments. Everyone had equal access to the knowledge encoded in the monuments. But written knowledge created new forms of inequality based on literacy, access to texts, and the specialized skills needed to interpret complex written information. More subtly, writing changed the temporal character of knowledge itself. Megalithic information was embedded in natural cycles, observable phenomena, and recurring events that connected communities to ongoing cosmic processes. Written information, by contrast, became fixed, static, divorced from the natural rhythms that had previously given knowledge its context and meaning. Archaeological evidence suggests that many communities resisted this transition for centuries. Sites across Europe show evidence of continued monument use long after writing had become available in the region. Some megalithic traditions persisted into the historical period, maintained by communities that understood something valuable would be lost if they abandoned their ancient knowledge systems entirely. But resistance could only last so long. Written civilizations had significant competitive advantages over megalithic societies. They could coordinate larger populations, accumulate more complex technologies, and adapt more quickly to changing circumstances. Eventually, most megalithic traditions were either abandoned or absorbed into writing-based cultures that preserved only fragments of the original knowledge systems. The transition wasn't just about technology. It represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness, from a worldview that saw knowledge as something embedded in the natural world to one that treated information as something that could be abstracted, manipulated, and controlled independently of its original context. This abstraction process accelerated dramatically with each subsequent information revolution. The printing press made written knowledge even more portable and accessible, but it also further removed information from the communal, ceremonial contexts that had once given it meaning. The telegraph and telephone enabled instant communication across vast distances, but they also fragmented knowledge into discrete messages divorced from the larger patterns and cycles that megalithic societies had considered essential. The digital revolution has taken this process to its logical extreme. We now have access to virtually unlimited information, instantly available, searchable, and constantly updated. But this information exists in a completely abstract realm, disconnected from physical place, natural cycles, community context, or embodied experience. We can access vast databases of knowledge without ever leaving our rooms, without interacting with other people, without engaging our bodies or senses in the learning process. The psychological and social consequences of this trajectory are becoming increasingly apparent. Despite having access to more information than any previous generation, we report unprecedented levels of confusion, anxiety, and meaninglessness. We're drowning in data while starving for wisdom. We can retrieve facts instantly, but struggle to understand their significance or apply them effectively to our lives. Part of the problem lies in what cognitive scientists call the paradox of choice. When information is abundant and easily accessible, we lose the ability to distinguish between what's important and what's trivial. Everything seems equally available and equally weightless. Without the natural filtering mechanisms that scarcity once provided, we become overwhelmed by options and paralyzed by possibility. But there's a deeper issue at work. The megalithic approach to knowledge wasn't just about storing information efficiently. It was about creating the psychological and social conditions under which information could be transformed into wisdom, understanding, and meaningful action. The monuments didn't just preserve data. They preserved the experiential contexts that gave data its significance. When you learned essential knowledge by participating in ceremonies at sacred sites, by observing astronomical alignments that your ancestors had carefully preserved, by engaging in communal activities that connected you to natural cycles and cosmic patterns, the information became integrated into your identity, your relationships, and your understanding of your place in the world. Learning wasn't just information acquisition, it was identity formation, community building, and spiritual development simultaneously. Modern information systems, for all their technical sophistication, have largely abandoned this integrated approach to knowledge. We treat learning as information consumption, education as data transfer, and wisdom as accumulated facts. But the megalithic evidence suggests that this approach fundamentally misunderstands how human knowledge actually works. Recent research in cognitive science and educational psychology confirms what ancient monument builders seem to have understood intuitively. Information learned through embodied experience, social interaction, and meaningful ritual is retained better, applied more effectively, and integrated more completely into personal identity than information acquired through abstract study. The most effective modern learning environments unconsciously recreate some of the conditions that megalithic societies built into their knowledge systems. Successful educational programs emphasize hands-on experience, community participation, and connections between abstract knowledge and meaningful personal goals. The most memorable and transformative learning experiences typically involve physical challenges, social bonds, and encounters with something larger than individual concerns. But these approaches remain exceptions in our educational systems, which are still largely organized around the assumption that efficient information transfer is the primary goal of learning. We've optimized for coverage rather than depth, quantity rather than quality, individual achievement rather than community understanding. The megalithic approach suggests a completely different set of priorities. Instead of trying to expose learners to as much information as possible, megalithic societies focused on embedding essential knowledge so deeply that it would be impossible to forget. Instead of emphasizing individual achievement, they created learning experiences that strengthened community bonds and shared identity. Instead of treating knowledge as abstract information, they embedded it in physical experiences that engaged the whole person. This difference in approach had profound implications for the durability and effectiveness of the knowledge systems involved. Megalithic knowledge survived for thousands of years without any institutional support, transmitted through communities that had no formal educational institutions, preserved by people who couldn't read or write, but who understood principles that modern civilization has largely forgotten. The contrast with modern knowledge systems is striking. Despite our sophisticated educational institutions, advanced information technologies, and massive investments in knowledge preservation, much of what we consider essential knowledge becomes obsolete within decades. Technologies that seemed revolutionary a generation ago are now incomprehensible to younger users. Cultural knowledge that was once considered fundamental is rapidly disappearing. Even scientific knowledge is subject to paradigm shifts that render previous understanding obsolete. This isn't necessarily a problem when knowledge is genuinely improving and previous understanding was genuinely flawed. But much of what we're losing isn't obsolete information. It's wisdom about fundamental human challenges that remain unchanged despite all our technological progress. We're losing understanding of how to create sustainable communities, how to find meaning and purpose in life, how to maintain psychological well-being, how to live in harmony with natural systems. These are precisely the kinds of challenges that megalithic societies addressed through their monument-based knowledge systems. They developed sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social organization, and ecological relationships that enabled them to create stable, meaningful, sustainable communities for thousands of years. Much of this understanding was embedded in the monuments themselves, in the ritual practices associated with them, and in the cultural traditions that grew up around them. When we abandoned megalithic knowledge systems in favor of writing-based alternatives, we may have gained efficiency and flexibility, but we also lost access to forms of wisdom that took millennia to develop and refine. The monuments preserve traces of this lost knowledge, but recovering it requires more than archaeological investigation. It requires understanding the principles that guided megalithic thinking and finding ways to apply those principles to our contemporary challenges. This doesn't mean we should try to recreate megalithic society, which would be neither possible nor desirable. But it does mean we should take seriously the possibility that our ancestors developed solutions to fundamental human problems that remain relevant today, even if the specific forms those solutions took are no longer applicable. The megalithic approach to knowledge preservation offers insights that could transform how we think about education, community organization, and the relationship between information and wisdom. Instead of focusing primarily on efficient data transfer, we could create learning environments that emphasize embodied experience, community participation, and connections to larger patterns and purposes. Instead of treating knowledge as private property to be accumulated by individuals, we could develop systems that embed essential understanding in shared experiences, communal practices, and collective institutions. Instead of assuming that newer information is automatically better than older understanding, we could create mechanisms for preserving and transmitting wisdom that has been tested across long periods of time. These aren't romantic fantasies about returning to a simpler past. They're practical suggestions for addressing real problems in contemporary knowledge systems. We have unprecedented access to information, but we're struggling to transform that information into effective action. We have sophisticated educational institutions, but they're failing to prepare people for the challenges they actually face in life. We have advanced technologies for storing and retrieving data, but we're losing touch with the deeper forms of understanding that give life meaning and direction. The megalithic evidence suggests that these problems aren't inevitable consequences of technological progress. They're the result of choices we've made about how to organize knowledge systems, choices that have prioritized certain values while neglecting others. By understanding the principles that guided megalithic knowledge systems, we can make different choices that preserve the benefits of modern technology while recovering forms of wisdom we've inadvertently abandoned. The monuments are still there, still functional, still encoding the principles that enabled their builders to create some of the most enduring achievements in human history. They're not just archaeological curiosities or tourist destinations. They're libraries written in stone, preserving understanding about fundamental human challenges that we're still struggling to address. But accessing this library requires learning to read a language we've largely forgotten, the the language of landscape, ceremony, and shared experience that our ancestors used to embed knowledge in the world itself. It requires understanding that information and wisdom are not the same thing, that efficient data transfer is not the same as effective learning, and that the goal of knowledge systems should not just be to store information, but to transform it into understanding that enhances human flourishing. The megaliths remember what we knew before we started confusing information with wisdom, before we began treating knowledge as a commodity to be consumed rather than a living tradition to be inhabited. They remember what it means to create learning environments that transform not just what people know, but who they are, not just how much they can recall, but how deeply they can understand, not just what they can achieve individually, but what they can accomplish together. Most importantly, they remember that the ultimate purpose of knowledge is not to accumulate facts or demonstrate cleverness, but to enable human communities to flourish across generations, to solve fundamental challenges that transcend individual lifetimes, and to participate meaningfully in patterns larger than personal concerns. In our age of information, overload, and existential confusion, these ancient lessons may be exactly what we need to remember. The stones are still teaching, still preserving the principles that enabled their builders to create lasting solutions to enduring human challenges. The question is whether we're ready to become students again, to learn from teachers whose classrooms are built of stone and starlight, whose curriculum spans millennia, and whose lessons are written in the language of permanence itself. The question becomes even more urgent when you realize what's happening to us right now, in real time, as you listen to this. Your brain, sitting there in the dark of your skull, is trying to process information in an environment it was never designed for. Every notification, every screen, every piece of digital stimulation is being interpreted by neural circuits that evolved to track mammoth migrations and recognize the subtle signs that winter was coming. You're running Paleolithic software on a quantum computing problem, and the system is starting to crash. But here's what the monument builders understood that we've completely forgotten. The human brain doesn't just store information. It transforms information into identity, into meaning, into the very structure of who you are. And that transformation doesn't happen through passive consumption. It happens through participation, through ritual, through the kind of embodied experience that makes knowledge stick not just in your memory, but in your bones. When you stood inside Stonehenge at dawn on the summer solstice, watching the sun rise through the heelstone, exactly as your ancestors had planned 5,000 years earlier, something happened in your neural pathways that no amount of reading about astronomy could replicate. Your brain didn't just process the information that the sun rises in the northeast on June 21st. It experienced the profound realization that you were part of a story that began before you were born and would continue long after you died. That's neurological alchemy. That's the transformation of data into wisdom, information into identity, knowledge into something that changes not just what you know, but who you are. Modern neuroscience has a term for this: embodied cognition. The idea that thinking isn't just something that happens in your brain, but something that involves your entire body, your environment, your social context. Ancient monument builders didn't have the scientific vocabulary, but they understood the principle perfectly. They knew that if you wanted knowledge to last, if you wanted it to transform people rather than just inform them, you had to embed it in experiences that engaged every aspect of human consciousness. This is why the monuments weren't just functional, they were overwhelming. The massive scale, the precise alignments, the acoustic properties, the way shadows moved across carved surfaces, the integration with landscape features. Every element was calculated to create what cognitive scientists now call a peak experience, a moment of such intensity that it burns itself into memory with perfect clarity. But we've systematically eliminated peak experiences from our learning environments. We've created educational systems that treat the human brain like a hard drive, something you can simply upload information to. We've forgotten that learning is transformation, not just information transfer. The consequences of this forgetting are everywhere around us. We have access to more information than any generation in history, but we're experiencing unprecedented levels of confusion, anxiety, and meaninglessness. We can Google any fact instantly, but we struggle to understand what those facts mean or how they connect to anything larger than our immediate concerns. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of wisdom. We've optimized our information systems for efficiency rather than transformation, for quantity rather than quality, for individual consumption rather than collective understanding. The megalithic approach was exactly the opposite. They optimized for transformation. Every piece of essential knowledge was embedded in experiences designed to change people, not just inform them. Learning wasn't something you did alone with a book. It was something that happened in community, in sacred space, through participation in rituals that connected you to natural cycles, ancestral wisdom, and cosmic patterns. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn, because we're not just losing ancient wisdom. We're losing the capacity to create new wisdom, and that loss is accelerating. Consider what happens when a society's primary method of knowledge storage becomes digital. Information becomes infinitely copyable, instantly searchable, constantly updatable. These seem like obvious advantages, and in many ways they are, but they also create unprecedented problems. When knowledge exists primarily in digital form, it becomes subject to what information theorists call bit rot. Digital files degrade over time, formats become obsolete, storage media fails, links break, servers go offline. The average lifespan of a web page is shorter than the average lifespan of a fruit fly. We're creating vast amounts of information every day, but we're also losing vast amounts of information every day. Future archaeologists trying to understand our civilization may find that the digital age left fewer recoverable traces than any previous period in human history. We're accidentally creating a new kind of dark age, one where information abundance creates information amnesia. But the problem goes deeper than technical failures. Digital information lacks what philosophers call ontological weight. It doesn't exist in any particular place, doesn't require physical effort to access, doesn't cost anything to copy. This makes it incredibly convenient, but it also makes it psychologically weightless. When information has no weight, when it costs nothing to acquire and nothing to lose, when it exists everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, it becomes very difficult for the human brain to treat it as important. We scroll through vast amounts of data without any of it sticking not because we're stupid or lazy, but because our neural circuits evolved to pay attention to things that required effort to obtain and would be costly to lose. Megalithic information systems worked with this aspect of human psychology, not against it. Knowledge was embedded in monuments that required enormous effort to create and maintain. Accessing that knowledge required physical journey, community participation, and engagement with ritual processes that demanded the time and attention. This made the knowledge precious in a way that digital information can never be. But the genius of megalithic knowledge systems wasn't just that they made information precious, they made it meaningful. Every piece of essential knowledge was embedded in stories, connected to natural cycles, and integrated into practices that served multiple functions simultaneously. You didn't just learn when to plant crops, you learned your place in the cosmic order, your connection to ancestral wisdom, and your responsibilities to future generations. This integration of practical knowledge with existential meaning created what psychologists call coherence, the sense that life makes sense, that your actions matter, that you're part of something larger than yourself. Coherence turns out to be one of the most important factors in human psychological well-being, but it's increasingly rare in modern life. We live in societies that fragment knowledge into specialized domains, separate practical skills from spiritual meaning, and treat individual achievement as more important than community belonging. The result is technically sophisticated but existentially hollow. We know more facts than our ancestors could have imagined, but we understand less about what those facts mean or how they fit together into a coherent vision of human purpose. The monuments offer a different model, one that integrates technical sophistication with existential meaning, practical knowledge with spiritual understanding, individual learning with community purpose. They show us what becomes possible when human societies align their knowledge systems with the deeper patterns that govern psychological well-being and social cohesion. But accessing this wisdom requires more than just studying ancient sites. It requires understanding the principles that guided their creation and finding ways to apply those principles to our contemporary challenges. One of the most important principles is what we might call knowledge embodiment. Instead of treating information as abstract data to be consumed passively, megalithic societies embedded knowledge in physical experiences that engaged the whole person. They understood that the human brain learns best when information comes through multiple sensory channels simultaneously, when it's connected to emotional significance, and when it's reinforced through physical action. So here we are, standing at the edge of a profound choice. The stones are still there, still functional, still encoding principles we desperately need to remember. They're not asking us to abandon our technology or retreat into some imagined golden age. They're asking us something far more challenging, whether we're brave enough to learn from teachers who thought in terms of millennia rather than moments, who embedded wisdom in stone rather than storing data in clouds, who understood that the deepest human knowledge lives not in our devices, but in our bones. The monuments remember what we've forgotten about building things that last. The question is whether we remember how to listen.